All right, so Nan, I will turn it over to you.
Okay.
I need to screen
Are we
share.
gonna have Mark
Well,
read
do
that?
you want to do the privilege of the floor?
Yeah, sorry,
Yes.
yeah.
And Barbara, you're gonna chair,
Oh, I can.
would you?
Yeah, who are the members who are here? Val? Michelle?
Val, yeah, you
Just
three.
Is Bruce online there on the phone?
Oh, and Bruce, and Bruce is,
I don't know why this,
I'm on the phone.
right, okay.
yeah, Bruce is here.
Okay,
Um,
so we have at least 4 zoning commission members, okay,
There's a quorum, but
okay, and we don't have Jean, right?
Probably not.
Okay, all right.
Great.
So we'll go ahead and get started with privilege of the floor. Will?
How does this work?
So you have 3 minutes to speak. I don't know, does Will have to come close to his?
But
speaker?
the clerk did tell me that at our last meeting, she had some difficulty, so do speak, use your speaking voice at the microphone, is all I would say.
The box on the table?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I did send an email to Jean to distribute to the zoning board. It's a fuller statement than what I am saying tonight, because there's so much more to be said. But first, I would like to say that I appreciate all the hard work that's going into the zoning law. Thank you. I know it's a lot of work. I'm here to advocate for putting age-friendly concepts back into the draft zoning law. Basically, the age-friendly concept is to make communities livable for people of all ages from birth to death. And it's an umbrella concept that covers a wide range of topics for organizing principles of livability, from housing and outdoor spaces, buildings, transportation, to respect and social inclusion, health services, and even emergency preparedness. So some of these items relate to the built environment and to land use more directly than others. But I've been working with Cornell's planning faculty member, Dr. Mildred Warner, and as she says, age-friendly is a way of thinking about your community. So I wanted to try to give a couple quick examples of how age-friendly considerations could be enacted in a town. One would be you could have age-friendly business designations. Chemung County has had a program for that since 2016, where businesses qualified by meeting criteria that go beyond just the physical layout of the business space to things like their web presence and visibility and sound, the handling of sound within a place of business. They even, in that particular county, they even recognize if a business trains its employees to respond to emergencies, like if somebody were to collapse in your business. Or it could be something like encouraging universal design in the built environment. The concept of universal design is basically design strategies that make a building safe and usable for people of as wide a range of mental and physical abilities as possible. So there is a city in California, Fremont, that has an ordinance that requires builders to offer accessibility features to their customers as an upgrade option. And these features include things like at least one bathroom on the primary entry level, handheld adjustable shower heads, switches at accessible heights, audio and visual doorbells, lever style door handles, things like that. So age-friendly communities is a concept supported around the world by New York State, by Tompkins County, by a lot of communities across the country, and by the town of Caroline. By the way, the city of Ithaca and Tompkins County have been designated as age-friendly communities, and New York State's Office for the Aging selected them to document their best practices as centers for excellence. So by way of this, their documentation has highlighted the need to link planning, design, services, and community engagement. And I'd like to remind folks that our county's former Deputy Commissioner of Planning, Ms. Joan Jerkowitz, applauded the town of Caroline's inclusion of the age-friendly concept in the comprehensive plan. This email was previously forwarded to the planning board and town board. It was back, I think it might have been January.
Well, you're at time, so can you conclude?
Yes.
Sorry.
So there was a statement in the draft. It was deleted due to confusion about its meaning and applicability. What I'd like to propose is the following statement of purpose to add to the zoning law purpose section. Include age-friendly communities considerations in the town's formulation and review of zoning provisions. I'm currently on the town's planning board and developing materials for the commission on tower siting strategy, and I'd be happy to also develop background materials on age-friendly communities concepts for the commission, so you have a standard set of questions or criteria to consider while you're crafting the zoning law. So that's it. And thanks for letting me go over a little.
Thank you, and I'd appreciate it, I think we'd all appreciate it if you send that in to the town clerk, and then she can make sure that we get it,
Sure.
the written.
Yeah, and it's a lot longer, and it gets a lot more documentation and links.
That'd be great if you send it all in. Okay. Anybody else for privilege of the floor?
If you're remote, raise your blue Zoom hand, or if we can see your hand. I don't see anything, Bart.
Nobody, and I'm not sure, are you here for privilege of the floor or just? You're here. Okay, great, okay. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approving the minutes from the June 27th, 2021 meeting. The minutes were prepared by Jean and sent around and got some comments and were revised. Any other comments? Any objections to the minutes? Hearing none, I'll take that as being approved. Thank you. Okay, now the town council liaisons report from Tim.
Not much to report to this month, but I can tell.
Okay,
So I think we're good.
all right. Planning committee update from Val.
Sure. Yeah, the planning committee seems to be working on and would be in the next meeting or two, probably finalizing the thing that has to do with the battery energy storage systems. They met with the fire chiefs from Slaterville and Speedsville to discuss the different sort of implications of what it means really locally for these things. And it seems that Underwriter Lab, for example, has tested a lot of these storage systems and found that there isn't, the fire hazards are really quite serious, mostly because it takes a huge amount of water. There has to be containment because of the chemicals and things that may be leached from it, the firefighting, but also that firefighting may require for certain parts of the batteries, other kind of chemicals and things. So these are the kind of things that they will be looking at. I think that it will be written into it will be written into their battery energy report. The things that may have an effect here has to do, but will also be part of their law as the site access aspects for fire trucks and things like that. And then otherwise, the planning board is really looking at developing some specific action items for dealing and being able to pick up some of the work that they could do with us. And they've appointed contact people actually for some of these things. One is critical environmental areas, another is telecommunications strategic plan, town conservation easements, and those. And then and if we got a note from Bill to do with certain of the other aspects of the planning in relationship to the zoning liaison.
Can you still hear us?
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Next is the consultants, Nan and Rick.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Very well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we have a packed meeting, maybe too ambitious for an hour and 10 minutes left, but we're going to try and do our best and cover an awful lot of material. I envision really the rest of the meeting is more of a presentation from Rick and I to go over some of our ideas and concepts, certainly to be followed up in many of the other meetings. But I don't think we're going to have a lot of time for much discussion tonight. So I apologize in advance for kind of unloading a lot of meaty stuff on you. A lot of it all at once, but we had the opportunity to put all of this together, so we're going to launch into it. I wanted to start off by just taking a few minutes to talk, just kind of circle back and re-discuss some basic zoning concepts related to site plan review, special use permits, and zoning as a whole, and how those three major pieces work together. And I felt like I wanted to take this little bit of time to do that because of some discussion that we had at our last meeting that that I kind of detected that there's some reluctance, there's still some reluctance about zoning and how people feel about zoning. And while I'm 100% a supporter of site plan review and think that it's a hugely important part of any kind of local land use law, I did want to take just a minute. So before we really launch into our more detailed discussions, that everybody understands what site plan does and doesn't do, and how it relates to the other pieces of zoning that we're going to be talking about over the next few months. So I just thought I would just quickly go over to make sure everybody is on the same wavelength about that. So I thank you for the time before we launch into our maps to let me do that. So site plan review, which you have a site plan review law currently now. Your task force recommended some updates to that site plan law. But the site plan is an extremely effective land use control. And it is quite a flexible kind of local law that can be tailor-made to address things that are of importance for each town. So every town and location can have a site plan law that's a little bit different because it can be oriented to the things that matter to you. At its essence, it addresses development and avoiding or mitigating impacts of that development on one parcel. So it's not applied to subdivisions because by its definition and how towns are authorized to do site plan laws, it is a one parcel at a time, one development at a time kind of look. So a site plan review is not typically applied to review any kind of a subdivision development. And it really has blinders as to the actual use. So it doesn't get into whether it's a restaurant or a gas station or a some sort of commercial business. It doesn't matter what the use is. It is looking at how the things on the parcel are functioning on that site. And so that's a really important piece to keep in mind, because site plan does not and cannot address the actual land use itself. You can't deny a project because it's a gas station and you don't want a gas station. The only way that you can get at looking at land uses is through the zoning law. So these pieces all fit together, but we do need to keep some of those things in mind. So in essence, the site plan law comes up with a map of the parcel and what is being planned: buildings, parking lots, signs, lights, drainage facilities, sidewalks, all of those things that are actually on the ground are mapped and identified and reviewed by the reviewing board. So it looks at where things are and how those things are functioning on the site. So the local law has to identify criteria on which those things are judged. So you have to say there's adequate parking, or there's, there has to be ADA compliant parking, or that there has to be no glare created by lights at the property edges. Whatever those standards might be, those have to be articulated in the law. And the things that are not articulated in your site plan law, the planning board really has no authority to look at. So if some situation, some proposal comes up and it has some sort of unique feature or unique something on the site that is not really specifically authorized for the reviewing board to look at, is out of the bounds of what they are authorized to do. And so that's why you often see a catch-all like and anything else, that the planning board or the reviewing board may come up with. But I wanted to make sure that everyone realizes is that the local law that's passed for site plan is authorizing what the reviewing board can look at, and really that boxes it in, and that's what they review. So the site plan is a wonderful tool that you can get at the arrangement of things on the parcel, the layout of things on the parcel, the design of whatever it is. And those are all important. They're important for the environment. They're important for character. So they're really, I'm not minimizing, and then I'm celebrating what site plan review can do. But what it cannot do, as I mentioned, is it cannot address whether that use is allowed or desired or not. It can't judge the use, as to whether it's an appropriate use for that location. It can only judge whether it's cited appropriately for that parcel. And there's no ability to deny a land use in a site plan review based on the desirability or the appropriateness of that use. There is also, by the way, the state has authorized towns to do site plan reviews, there is no power locally to interpret a site plan decision. So when the reviewing board says yes or no to, to some site plan review, that there's no legal way to have that interpreted by, for instance, the zoning board of appeals. And the only way to argue or to try and overturn a decision that was made locally related to site plan reviews is through an Article 78 proceeding. So there is some limitation to a site plan law in terms of uses, in terms of how it's interpreted, in terms of how people have recourse if they disagree with the decision that's been made. And so I don't want the zoning commission to I don't want there to be a misinterpretation that site plan is a substitute for zoning. It's a complement to zoning. It addresses different things and it works with the standards that you might have in a zoning law that might say we want certain uses or certain uses in certain locations, which is in the purview of the zoning law. So the site plan, you can think of the site plan looks at things on the ground and its complementary procedure when it's included in zoning is what's called a special use permit. And a special use permit is kind of the opposite. The special use permit looks at the use and it looks at how that use specifically functions. So it is looking at how does a gas station function in that location, or how does a store function in that location? And so oftentimes in communities that have zoning, the site plan looks at siting and the special use permit looks at certain uses and how those uses specifically are going to be allowed or not allowed in the community. The special use permit is only within the zoning law. A site plan law, as you have now, can be a standalone law. It does a lot better when they're meshed together. So as we have talked about from the beginning, putting your site plan law or section as a section into the zoning is makes it a much more efficient tool to integrate with all of the pieces that we're going to be talking about. So the special use permit, should the zoning commission and the town ultimately decide that there are certain uses that you want to have special standards for, that's where the special use permit comes in. And you can have some things that require both site plan review and a special use permit, or some uses might need just site plan review. So these are all things we're going to be talking about as we go along. But I really felt after some of the conversation we had last time that it was important to not elevate site plan review to be the be all and end all to everything that we may want to accomplish. It certainly can accomplish a lot, but it can't accomplish certain things by its definition in that it's limited to a single parcel at a time and looking at things and how things are situated on that parcel. So pulling that all together and thinking about all of these things that we have to think about, I urge the zoning commission and other folks in the community who are watching is to go back to the very first document that we looked at in our process, which was that zoning checklist, because that identifies all of the pieces or all of the elements that the comprehensive plan asked the zoning commission to look at. So it's really not our, we all have personal opinions in areas where we think one thing should be stronger than another. We're all going to have those kinds of discussions, but our marching orders comes from the comprehensive plan. And so I urge you all to go back and look at that checklist. In that left-hand column lists all the topics that the comprehensive plan asked to be addressed and protected, maintained, enhanced, or whatever the words might be. So as we go along and we look at what the comprehensive plan asks us to do, and then we have to think, well, what's the best technique to address those topics that are of importance to the town? Is it site plan review? Is it a special use permit? Is it both? Is it neither? So I really, we will continue to have discussions about how these tools all work together. But I wanted to just take these few minutes to go back and give that little background on how these things all work together to make a full kind of toolbox that will be further fleshing out as we go along. And the other thing about site plan review is right now you have the site plan review law is applied to, there was, I don't know, 8 or however many bulleted types of things are subject to site plan review. Usually site plan review is oriented to commercial uses and sometimes multifamily, which is in yours. But your current law is written at a 10,000 square foot building size. So it doesn't capture everything. And the proposed site plan that came from the land use task force recommended that be lowered to 3,000 square feet, which is certainly better. But that still doesn't capture everything, not all commercial uses. And there are some other issues that we'll talk about as we get along. But I just wanted to convey that site plan goes a long way, but it's not everything. And to be honest, I don't think that all of the things that your comprehensive plan asks for, I don't think can be all addressed solely through site plan review law. So with that background, as I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but I wanted to just kind of refresh everybody's memory on, what those are and what those aren't.
So Nan,
yes.
can we take questions from the commission members on these points now?
If you'd like, we could take a few more minutes. I know that gives us about an hour to get through our maps. But sure, let's take a few minutes if you have some burning questions about that.
So let's just see if there are burning questions that you want clarification. It looks like Bruce has a question. Bruce?
Yeah. So my understanding is that with site plan, there is no view. You can't get a review. Look like with our site plan review law, you can't get a special use permit. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. They're two totally different things authorized.
I can't hear you.
Two totally different laws. So the special use permit is oriented to placing conditions on the use. So let's say you have a gas station proposed. It's the special use permit that would impose for instance, prevent them from having one of those, the gas pump TVs. Have you ever seen them? I'm just pulling an example out of a hat. A lot of places don't allow them because they have noise. That is getting at the use of the gas station, not how it's cited on the parcel. So site plan review, that would be a stretch to be covered under a site plan law, because that's getting at regulating the use.
Okay, thank you.
So you can't get a special use permit.
No, a site
Okay.
plan approval is a totally different thing from a special use permit. In the zoning that many communities have both. They have a site plan review and they have a special use permit, but they are two totally different things. They derive their authority from two totally separate state laws.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Ernie, Val, Michelle, any other questions? Did you see, Mark, is Ernie raising his hand at all?
I don't think so.
Okay,
Let's see.
Val, you're okay? Michelle?
Sorry.
you're
No,
okay?
no, I'm not. I have no questions. This is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think that's all the commission members. So thank you, Nan. And I think at this point, we can move on to the presentation about the many, many layers in the PDF map.
Right. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and we are going to go through all of the great GIS work that Rick did for you in the last couple of weeks, which was a yeoman's amount of work. He's going to explain and go through quickly the layered map to look over the resources, explain the gradient map that kind of looks at how they all overlap. And then we're going to present some of our ideas for potential zoning to start thinking about zoning districts. So I'll turn it over to Rick, and then I'm going to jump in on and off during the presentation.
Thanks, Nan. So as Nan said, I was going to start with the layered PDF. So let me see if I can do that. Let's see. Come on. Okay. All right. So is the PDF up?
There
It
is.
doesn't show me what's sharing. Okay. So hopefully most everyone was able to get this open. I know some people had a little trouble, but I think everyone hopefully eventually got it. So the way this map is set up for those who haven't had a chance to get to explore it yet, I'll just go over very briefly. There's on the left-hand side, if you don't see this option, there's this little arrow on the left to expand. And then this stack of squares is the layer list. And when you first open it, all the resource layers will be on. I've already gone ahead and turned them off just to speed things up. And so on this map, it's not every conceivable resource in the town, but it's, the majority of them and the important ones, mostly identified in the comp plan and or the NRI or the climate action plan. And there may be something in here that wasn't in any of those, but so you can turn these on and off with clicking the little eye icon. And for example, this first layer, this is the Class A watershed in the town. As you can see, it covers the north and west quadrant of the town. So it covers a lot of the hamlet areas. A lot of the developed part of the town falls within this this Class A watershed. And these are all, as I'll show you a little bit later, a lot of these layers are how we, as Nan mentioned, sort of got into where these either zoning districts or zoning overlay lines got drawn. But I'm just going to quickly step through. So Class A watershed, DEC classifies waters in the state from A to D. A is drinking water classification. So all the streams within this shaded area are classified as Class A drinking water streams. And that's important when you're thinking about zoning. If you want to have in your zoning, water quality protection, for instance, you could potentially use this just as it is, the watershed, like as an overlay for water quality protection, for example. We also looked at farmland soils. So the yellow is the prime farmland soils. Those are what USDA has determined to be sort of the highest quality soils for farmland production. And then this lighter green, just quickly, the dark green blocks, those are all your protected lands in the town. So the lighter green is soil of statewide importance. So again, important soil, not as important in USDA's determination as prime farmland soils, but these are soils the state has said, these are important for farmland. Forests. So this map is showing sort of two layers of forest. There's sort of these 100-acre forest blocks in the lighter green, and then forest cores, which is the darker green. So the forest blocks are 100 acres or more. And this is sort of a category that DEC, 100-acre forest or more is important for habitat and species conservation and things like that. Under 100 acres, yes, trees are important, but it's fragmented. It's hard for anything to, of significance to live there, things like that. And then the core forests are the sort of unfragmented core of these larger forest patches. And so those are the areas that are 100 meters or more from the edges. So in theory, while there may be some houses in there, there's not roads and things like that bisecting the forest. So these are sort of the most critical for habitat for larger animals, usually more rare and endangered species, things like that. Climate resiliency, this is a layer, when and if it loads here. This is created by the Nature Conservancy back in 2016, I believe it was. They looked at a whole host of factors, but the idea with climate resilient areas is that there's a combination of topography and natural conditions that will allow, as climate changes, will allow species to basically migrate from where they are now, north, south, east, west, a small amount, up, down, to sort of maintain sort of the type of environment they're used to. So these are usually areas with slopes, forests, wet areas, things like that. Large flat areas like farm fields typically aren't great for climate resiliency, because if the climate conditions change and something's living there, there's nowhere for them to go because it's all the same everywhere around them. Next layer here is Natural Heritage Program modeled rare species. What the Natural Heritage Program in New York State did was they took known areas of rare and endangered habitats, looked at what made those good for whatever plants or animals they were looking at, and then statewide said, okay, well, where are there areas in the state that sort of match these habitat areas? And so this doesn't necessarily mean there's anything rare or endangered in any of these areas, but these are areas that are suitable for those species. Most of the town where these areas occur, it's just one species occurrence that's predicted. There are some areas on the eastern slopes and western slopes along this valley near the hamlet of Whitechurch that has more than one species predicted to be able to be living there. Wetlands, as you know, there's natural or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maps wetlands, DEC maps wetlands, but the county several years ago, and this is in your comprehensive plan, did their own wetland mapping, which they believe, and is probably true, to be much more accurate as far as the boundaries of the wetlands. And so we used those same county wetlands for our analysis, and then we looked at where the county mapped wetlands intersected with the DEC mapped wetlands, and we applied the DEC regulatory 100-foot buffer to any of those county mapped wetlands that appear to also be DEC wetlands. Water buffers and riparian areas. So Natural Heritage Program in 2018, I believe it was, mapped out the riparian areas for most of the streams in New York State. And so the riparian areas are the areas near the stream that are important for aquatic habitats near the stream, potential flooding, things like that. And rather than a straight X number of feet buffer, they looked at soils and slopes and things like that to come up with the riparian buffer. And then, so we took that sort of as a base. the FEMA flood zones, which unfortunately for Caroline tend to be rather old and therefore potentially outdated. There's newer flood mapping for many municipalities in New York State. Caroline is not one of them. But we included that in there as they are right now. And then we also did just sort of take that straight buffer. The riparian and the flood zones are important for, especially important for flooding. If we're concerned about having our zoning crafted in such a way that we want to try to keep flooding to a minimal for development. But then if we're also concerned about water quality, the riparian areas also get at that, but then having sort of a straight buffer goes beyond those riparian areas. So, inflow to these streams. For the purposes of our analysis, we did a 100-foot buffer on all the DEC Class C streams, and then a 200-foot buffer on the Class A, again, drinking water streams. So that's these darker blue areas you see here. Steep slopes, we use the same, basically anything over 15% in most locations is considered a steep slope. And I believe it was the comprehensive plan or the NRI, I can't remember which, sort of talks about sort of two layers of steep slopes, 15 to 25% and greater than 25%. So we sort of mimic that same breakdown in this map. So the lighter pinks are the 15 to 25%, and then the dark reds are the 25% and over slopes, so the much steeper slopes. And as far as the slopes, I'm just going to go back to that very quickly. Slopes are important for habitat. They're important for water quality. If you develop a slope, you can create runoff issues. But something that obviously you're all aware of, and Nan and I were struck by when we visited, is almost everywhere you look, there's these what look like vertical. Obviously, they're not vertical, but there's these just steep hillsides everywhere. So just from a scenic resource point of view, all these steep slopes have a lot of aesthetic value for the town. Flood zones I mentioned, these, like I said, they're within the water resource, well, I haven't gotten to the water resource, but the water sort of buffers, but just so you can see as they're mapped currently, 6 Mile Creek, of course, is a lot of them. There's some along that make up basically the eastern boundary of the town, and then there's some in the valley here. And then lastly, for the resource layers, not so much a natural resource, but as I mentioned, scenic, your comprehensive plan has, I think it was 23 scenic points or something like that. So we actually, using the county land cover data and using those points, modeled the view shed from those 23 points. And so this dark purple area, these are all the areas that are predicted to be seen from those 23 points. It could be more, it could be less, but approximately this is the view shed from those areas. So anyone who opened this map up saw, like I said, all those layers are on when you first open it, and it's virtually impossible to read. So with the layered PDF, we can look at all these layers individually. When you have your own time, you of course, can zoom in on different areas that you may be interested in, turn layers on and off, see what's there, see how those intersect. But one thing we did was we took all these layers and actually stacked them all up on each other, using the same color and a high level of transparency, so you can sort of see. As we went through, you sort of got a sense of where there's overlap. But when we actually overlap them, you can really get more of a sense of where there's a lot of resources overlapping. There's very few places in the town where there's not at least one resource, as you can see. And many areas in town where there's many resources overlapping. Especially in the wooded Highland, areas south of 79. a lot of that, of course, is protected already. So we don't really have to worry about that as far as zoning goes. But there's a large swaths of areas with a lot of overlapping resources. A lot of that's the forested areas in town, because the forested areas, a lot of the slopes are in the forested areas, a lot of the climate resilient areas, a lot of the species are in the forests, etc. And so, like I said, this sort of stacks everything on top of each other, so you can get sort of a 40,000 foot view of where those things are all overlapping. And this, as I'll explain when we go into the next step, sort of shows how we got at some of the overlays and things like that where we're suggesting the town could consider for zoning. So I'm just going to pause before we move into the zoning piece. If anyone has any questions on either of those, the layered PDF or the resources or anything like that, before I move on to how we turn that into potential zoning.
Any questions from the commission members? Al? No. Michelle? No. Ernie or Bruce?
I don't see
Nope,
any.
not for me.
Not for me. That's very clear, great tool.
Great, Rick, that was. I'll just echo what Ernie said. Very clear explanation, great tool, and we all look forward to exploring it on our own.
Okay, great. So let me, the sharing won't let me share the screen. I have to do it window by window. So let me get the next thing open here. Let's see if this will work. I think I probably am gonna have to. There we go. Okay, so now you should see a PowerPoint slide. Yes, good. Okay, so now we're gonna, Nan and I jointly are sort of gonna walk through the zoning. So there's two things. There's the mapping, just the different options for mapping, but within that we've come up with a few different scenarios of how we could craft a zoning map and zoning districts for the town. Excuse me. So I'm going to introduce each one, show you the maps, and then I'll sort of explain from a regulatory point of view what some of the advantages, disadvantages of those might be and how they might work. And we'll just step through, and there's 4 scenarios. And there's actually, in theory, infinite scenarios, but 4 primary scenarios we're going to look at, and afterwards we'll talk about how you can potentially mix and match some of them. But so the first scenario is sort of the most simple. Is you have one district for the town. The whole town is one zoning district, and then we use overlays to get at those resources we just talked about. And like I said, I'll let Nan talk about why we may or may not do that. I'm just going to show you what that would look like. So we start with a town, just as it is. So one of the overlays, there's 4 overlays that Nan and I have come up with a 5th potential being that Class A watershed we talked about earlier. So the first one is the what we are calling the natural resource overlay. And that covers, a large portion of the town, and that's based on the wetlands and those the regular wetland buffers for the DEC wetlands, steep slopes, forest cores, the large forest, 100-acre forested areas, climate resilient areas, and rare species. And that's, so it's not, this map isn't showing where all those things are. What it is it's looking where at least there's some overlap with some of these resources. So there could be wetlands and forest, or there could be slopes and rare species, or there could be 4 of those things, or all of those things. But if there's only 1 of those things, unless it's the 25% or above steep slopes, or the core forest, those are the 2 that by themselves are in this no matter what. Everything else, there's an overlap for it to be showing here. And when just like anything with, you have different resolutions of data and things like that. So I won't get into all the details on the nuance of how this layer is made, but this isn't necessarily showing every last little piece of overlap, because there's, an acre over here or a half acre over here where things are overlapping, and we're not going to regulate tiny little, islands. So it has to be in order for this map to be drawn the way it was, basically anything less than 5 acre island was taken off this overlay, just for simplicity. And then within, the map, if there was a hole, here's a hole here. If there was a hole less than 5 acres, we filled that in, so you don't have, Swiss cheese everywhere. And that's basically the same you'll see on the other overlays, sort of just to smooth it out a little bit. So it's not so fine grained that you're looking at every square foot of land. So the next overlay we talked about using is an agricultural resource overlay. This is a much less, less number of layers as the natural resource, because that one covers a lot. So for agriculture, we're looking at open fields that are on parcels that are currently coded as having agricultural use. And so for those familiar with the assessor class codes in the tax parcel data, that's everything in the 100 classes, as well as, I'm going to get this wrong, but I believe it's 242, which is residential with agriculture. So it's technically the primary use is a house, but a significant portion of the property is being used for agriculture, so it's zoned as residential with agriculture. So we looked at land use classifications, where are the ag fields, and then sort of clipped those to which parcels are actually being used for agriculture, because some of the areas that are in the land use look like ag fields might actually just be a large meadow and things like that. So we just wanted to restrict it to areas that are classified as actually being used in agriculture. You could refine this even further and just look at parcels that are receiving agricultural tax assessment, but we didn't want to go that deep, nor did we have that data. And then the other piece that's on this map is also those prime farmland soils. So it's the fields that are on active farm parcels and the prime farmland soils. And again, anywhere where there's like little slivers of prime soil that aren't actually, significant, those were clipped out, holes were filled in, etc. And we can talk about after, how you would use this overlay, but just so you can visually see, what those, if you were to have an ag resource overlay, this is what it could look like. Next is what we're calling the water resource and flooding overlay. And so the idea with this would be, areas that are important for flooding and or water quality. And so the layers that went into this overlay are those FEMA flood zones, the riparian areas, which I spoke about earlier. And I also mentioned the 100-foot stream buffers on Class C streams, 200-foot buffer on the Class A streams, and then also those same buffers applied to any water bodies, ponds, lakes that intersect a Class C stream, a Class A stream. And then the last overlay, other than, like I said, that potential watershed overlay, is the scenic resources. And as I explained, this is based on the view shed from those 23 points. Again, smoothed out to get rid of small little areas and get rid of holes and things like that. So, the easiest way to see this is as I just walked through all the overlays individually. If you stack them all on top of each other, this is supposed to be the simple scenario, and obviously it starts to look complicated, but hopefully, as you saw, when you look at the overlays individually, it's not necessarily as complicated as this map looks. But you can see, using just those 4 overlays, a large percentage of the town would have some sort of regulation on top of a base zoning district. So I will let Nan talk about that for a few minutes before we move on to the second scenario.
Thanks, Brett. So So the idea behind this scenario was to use a base zoning district that treats everywhere in town basically the same, from the kind of, everyone would share a basic set of regulations that would address whatever the uses and the dimensions that we ultimately choose. Having one district would treat the northern part exactly the same as the southern part. And so from that perspective, it's a very simplistic way of looking at zoning. We treat every place pretty much like every other place. The downside of that is that we don't, I think that there are differences in the town. We have certain areas along the highway corridors. We have some hamlets that are different. And so when you have just one big zoning district of the whole town, you would not really be able to differentiate between a hamlet area and say someplace out on a back road somewhere. Certainly, the site plan review could cover siting issues on a parcel by parcel basis. We could set some uses that would require a special use permit so that again, the special use permit is oriented to uses that are allowed and permitted, but have some sort of condition attached to them in order to have them fit into that particular location. But that in and of itself, could be your zoning without just, kind of just the one zoning, and that's kind of, we fashion it and have all of the regulations oriented similarly. The concept of adding in these overlays is because your comprehensive plan is very oriented to environmental protection, habitats, water quality, rural character, farming, all of those things that are natural resource based. So this possibility kind of combines a base zoning district with a very environmentally oriented perspective, where each overlay district would have certain development standards. And Rick and I are not, I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we are not recommending that uses be that the overlay means you're prohibiting uses. We're trying to find a way here to balance development with protection and maintenance and enhancement of the assets that you have in the town. So the overlay districts would basically, you have to think about, we have a base zoning district that says we're going to allow certain things at a certain lot size or density with a certain kind of setback, for instance. The environmental overlay sits on top of that and says, oh, you have a wetland on the property. Well, that means we have to cite it in a certain way, or maybe you have to have a different kind of stormwater management plan to ensure that the water is taken care of. Or if it's in a view shed overlay, maybe something would have to be screened or buffered. Or in an ag overlay, we would say that a major subdivision, for instance, would have to be designed in what we call a conservation subdivision method, so that we have open space included in the development. So each one of these layers can tailor the development standards that we ultimately choose, tailored to that particular resource. And granted, if you've seen on all of these maps, there is a significant amount of overlap in some locations. And generally when we have multiple overlays, so each overlay, kind of think of it as a sandwich. So if you happen to be in a location that had floodplains, wetlands, steep slopes, and a view shed, then you would have additional development standards to address each one of those overlays. So the underlying zoning, as we have in all of our zoning, has the uses that you are going to allow there and the dimensions of things that you will allow, and the process that you will review them, which would be either site plan or special use permit, or they don't need any review at all. If it's, usually houses are just allowed to be built at whatever kind of density without review board approval. But the overlays get at those critical environmental features that we've been talking about. So that is like a really quick overview of this system, and we'll move on to the next level.
Thanks, Ann. So the second possibility we wanted to look at gets, a little bit, we add a few more things in. And so that's the second idea is 2 districts. So we would have a hamlet district and everywhere else district, basically. And then we would still have those same overlays available as an option. So, sure. Sorry, it was asking me to admit Ernie back in. So this is sort of our second scenario, which is the idea of hamlet districts. And so the idea would be, for this, we looked at, and I'll step through them a little bit zoomed in just so you can see them a little more closely. But the idea is there'll be 5 areas that are in this hamlet district. And we looked at each of the named hamlets in town, and then looked at environmental features, parcel lines, land use, to try to see where it made sense to show, where is the hamlet currently and where might it make sense, if possible, to expand into. And so, as you'll see, there's 5 areas. There's, I believe, 10 named hamlets in Caroline. So we didn't pick up all of them, but we did combine West Slaterville and Slaterville Springs into one larger hamlet, as you'll see in a second. So these are 2 separate ones, but they're next to each other, so it was easy enough to put them on this one slide. So we've got the Beesmer hamlet in the northwest. This is very residential in nature, almost village-like, as Nan and I drove down off of 79. A lot of similar lot sizes in this area, residential in nature, very little commercial, some apartments, and then some larger lots that potentially that could be some infill development, but there are some environmental features which aren't showing on this little zoom in, but when we see the overlays, if you zoom in, you can see that there's some streams and some slopes to consider. And then Brooktondale, this is one of the more what I would consider established hamlets, from appearances. You've got a mix of residential and commercial uses. Nan and I enjoyed a nice lunch there. And so again, this is the boundaries, and this is our interpretation of the boundaries. One of your tasks will be to, if we're going to keep hamlets, look at these boundaries, decide, should it be bigger, should it be smaller, should this be in, should this be out. But we're just looking at it from environmental features, land use, existing land use, and parcel boundaries. So again, this covers a lot of the existing hamlet style development, small lots, residential commercial mix, a 1960s, I believe it was, subdivision, some other small house lots, and then some larger areas that, are currently used for one thing or another, but could potentially be an expansion area for the hamlet in the future. So as I mentioned, West Slaterville to the west, Slaterville Springs, these two are so close together that, having them as two separate hamlets, it might be more conducive to sort of think of them as one larger contiguous area. While currently there's obviously some differences, Slaterville Springs, you have your town hall, you have a relatively speaking large apartment building, some commercial development, as where West Slaterville is, residential in nature. You still have the small lots, they're close to one another, and you only have, a few larger pieces of land between the two of them, which could potentially, infill to sort of merge them someday. The lots to the north and south of 79 here, the northern lot extends beyond this map, and I believe the southern one does as well. So we looked at sort of, whenever we do zoning, we try not to split parcels whenever we can if we're drawing district lines. But sometimes it makes sense just based on the topography or natural features or just parcel to parcel. So, to the south, we're using 6 Mile Creek sort of as a dividing line. And to the north, there's a couple parcels that end, right along here and here. And so sort of just connecting the dots between the two to maintain sort of a frontage area, which might be part of the hamlet, and then leaving the remainder of that parcel for agriculture and whatever. Caroline Center, this is one of, the smallest of the hamlets that we included in a hamlet district. But it is, you've got a 4 corners, you've got some smaller lot residential. And so we basically grabbed those parcels and then some areas around where you could expand that hamlet a little bit. And then Speedsville is the last one we mapped out. And obviously the main hamlet is sort of at this T intersection in the town green. We extended it out to the town line to the east. And then there's this cluster of development, it's older farm buildings and things like that. But compared to everywhere else, it's, there's some smaller lots and things like that. And so if you wanted to have a growth area for Speedsville, you could see it expanding out 115 to the northwest and maybe some of this area to the north, using the creek sort of as a southern bounding line again. And as I mentioned, you would still, potentially, if you went this route of having a hamlets district and an everything else district, you would potentially use some or all of these overlays again to, get at all the things that Nan spoke about before when we were just looking at the one zoning district. So I'll let Nan talk about that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, so I think, Rick did a really thorough job of talking about it. So this idea takes us up a level so that we can use the zoning to fine tune your future land use development in focus on the hamlets and treat them differently than the rest of the town. So but the key to note is that we're really creating one hamlet district here so that there would be one set of development regulations or rules for development that would apply the same exact way in each of those 5 hamlet areas. So there would this scheme does not distinguish between Slaterville or Speedsville. They would, from a zoning perspective, they would have the same use table, they would have the same dimensions, they would have the same conditions that you may choose to have towards special use permits. The site plan review would get at again the parcel by parcel differences there, but in all other respects, we're not distinguishing from one to the other. This would allow us to focus more dense growth and more mixed use and commercial growth for the hamlets, which is talked about in the comprehensive plan. And it would allow us to promote the current development patterns that you see in the hamlets, which, as Rick said, were typically smaller lot sizes. The houses are closer to the road. You know, have a possibility to have mixed uses in there, whereas everywhere else in town, it would allow you to establish a different set of development standards that would promote farming and open space, and rural residential and home occupation, maintain or promote your rural character out in those areas that may be different than what you have in the hamlets. And as Rick said, one or more of those overlay districts could still be used to address the environmental features. And I know when you put all of those together, it's like, wow, there's like a lot of stuff going on. But you have to keep in mind that the overlay districts are designed to promote development standards oriented to that specific, whatever that environmental overlay feature would be. So it looks complicated from a mapping point of view, but as you can see here, this would be your two base zoning districts, hamlets, and everywhere else. We haven't come up with a good name yet for what everywhere else would be yet, but just for now, that's what we're calling it. So we'll go on to the next idea that kind of builds on this.
Sure. So
Just to note that you have 13 minutes and two
Okay.
zoning district possibilities. So
Nope, the next one will be quick.
yeah, the next one's pretty simple. So the next one is basically what we just looked at, but treating those 5 hamlets differently. So it looks like almost the exact same map, but with some colors added. So the idea here is you would have a different zoning designation for each of the 5 hamlet areas we've identified. And then again, that everything else district. And again, you could apply the overlays. So, and there, see, I'm done already. Back to me.
And I'll only just say that this really gives us the opportunity to create development standards that would really pick up on unique features that would be in each hamlet. So we can really target whether it be lot sizes or uses or setbacks or some other feature that would be unique to treat, for instance, Speedsville different than Slaterville. So that again allows us to more fine tune the development standards to perpetuate those unique characters. So that's all I say about that one.
Okay.
All right.
So that brings us to the last, well, last for tonight, but not last, I'm sure, overall possibility, which is sort of moving away from mostly overlays with a couple districts to multiple zoning districts and sort of limiting overlays. So this is what we came up with. So I'll try to go through it in a couple minutes, and so man has some time here. So the idea with this map and possibility is you'd have those 5 hamlet areas we talked about. And in working through, we might decide we do want to treat hamlets separately, but maybe, you know, these 2 hamlets are so similar, we're going to group those into one zoning district, and now we only have 4 hamlet districts, even though there's 5 hamlets. So we've got those 5 hamlet districts, and then we have this magenta area on 79 that we're calling the commercial district. And the idea with that one is this is an area where you already have some sort of what I consider, for Caroline at least, larger scale commercial development. You know, some like farm equipment, looks like sales or rental, self-storage, I believe, was up there, and some other things, as well as some larger lots sort of in that same area. And so the idea with this district is, well, yes, we've heard and we understand and we agree that having commercial within the hamlets is important for the hamlets, there are certain types of commercial that just don't fit literally, sometimes size-wise or figuratively in a hamlet. And so this is an area along 79 that we identified that seemed appropriate for some of that larger scale commercial. We know we don't want, a highway commercial along all of 79. We heard that, we understand that. But we felt it was important to identify at least one area where some of those larger commercial uses would have a home. And then industrial is this sort of darker blue purple area. And that is where you've got a large gravel operation quarry, which, that is technically an industrial use currently. But in the future, if they want to expand, there's some room in this district as we've drawn it for that. Or, if it's going to be reclaimed for some other use, it might make sense to continue to be an industrial type use. So it's a small area, but an important area in town. Agriculture, which does not mean only agriculture is allowed, but the primary use in this area is agriculture, is this tan area throughout the town. And that would be, as it implies, agriculture and potentially other rural type of uses. And then this green, rural / conservation, if you think back to that natural resource overlay, this sort of takes the place of that. And so similar to the things we talked about that are important for that natural resource overlay, basically converting, rather than having it crossing multiple types of land uses and zoning, this would be, these areas of the town would be part of that sort of natural resource conservation, rural development. So again, as Nan said earlier, it would not mean development is not allowed in this green area. It would just mean, these areas, would have standards with, that rural character and conservation in mind. And then, I said less overlays. We think there would probably still, we would still recommend sort of a water resource flooding overlay, because again, that was mentioned in the comprehensive plan, the NRI, the climate action plan. And, this water resource overlay cuts across hamlets, it cuts across agriculture, it cuts across commercial, it cuts across, rural conservation, it goes across everything. So you can't really create a obvious district for water resources. So treating it as an overlay, having, special standards for those areas, we felt would be important. And I'll turn it back to Nan to sort of summarize everything.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't have a lot to say about this that hasn't already been said, other than it allows us to continue to fine tune the development standards for each of those areas. So this one has more districts that incorporates, and the text would again have the same components for each zoning district, would have a use table, dimensions, special uses that you may want in some areas and not others. And so this kind of development zoning scenario gives you a lot more ability to fine tune where and what you want, how you want it, how much you want it. And we think that, this is, having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 basic zoning districts is not overwhelming. I mean, lots of communities have way more, but we think this reflects, if you wanted to go this route, we think this reflects what you have going on in the town, and that we could fashion development regulations for each one of those areas oriented to, again, tie back to what your comprehensive plan is asking us to look at. And so this, Rick, was that the last slide?
That is the last slide.
Yes. So we have like 5 minutes, and I wanted to make sure that this was like a quick overview. I know it's throwing an awful lot at everybody, We will be posting to the Google Drive all of these maps along with the PowerPoint. And I developed a narrative that goes through in written form everything that we just talked about tonight, as well as including some definitions. So if you wonder, like, what is an overlay district, or what are we calling a hamlet? We have those definitions for you. And so we can leave, 5 minutes for questions, but I think that what I suggest between now and our next meeting is that everybody really think about these. Go back to that zoning checklist that we started off with, because that's a summary of the comprehensive plan policies. And look at the layers of the map, learn about all of how the interaction, look at the different zoning scenarios, and come prepared to the next meeting with concerns, questions, things you don't understand, things you want more explanation on, your gut feeling, what works, what doesn't. And I think what I would suggest that we do for our next meeting is that we leave off decision-making about them for right now, but we spend at least one meeting going around the table and asking, what do people think? What are their impressions? What are their gut reactions? What are their concerns? And what are their questions that Rick and I can then answer? And I think once we kind of understand how everybody feels about it in an open and honest, non-judgmental way, we can then at the following meeting start diving into the significant questions. And in the narrative that you will have, and I will email this to you, and it will also be on the Google Drive, we have outlined kind of a decision-making tree. Which scenario do you like? Do you want to treat hamlets all the same or different? What about the boundaries of the hamlets? How do we treat those? So it leads you through the specific questions that we will need to answer as we move along. So for now, I think it's really just trying to absorb some of this information, scratch your head, think about it, write down your questions, and we will regroup at the next meeting. At least that's my recommendation on how we start using all of this information. So we have 2 minutes. Anything we can accomplish in 2 minutes, I turn it back to the commission.
So Nan, I have a question for you just about process, given your experience in these matters. This has been very interesting thinking about these different scenarios, at first presentation. At what point have you found it instructive and useful to share these kinds of scenarios for a public meeting to get public input? Is this too early in the process? Is this something that we should be thinking about sooner rather than later? Or what's your experience with those kinds of informed discussions?
Sooner than later. I think it's very important. And I think if you go back and look at the proposal I wrote for the town, you would see that I had our first public input after the zoning commission has kind of digested some of this. I think it's important for the zoning commission to think about and discuss these a little bit, because if there's something on here that universally is like not at all going to fit you, we should know that. But you might want to, the commission might say, hey, we want to spend a month and limit our 4 choices to 2 choices. Or you might say, we want to present this to the whole community and get more input. But so I think sooner than later, but not like next month. I would like to hear some feedback first from the zoning commission to see whether we're at all on the right path that you feel is comfortable. And if it's comfortable, we can mix and match and change these. But if none of these are comfortable for you and we haven't hit the mark at all, I wouldn't want to go to the public yet until we have, something that is workable, you know, that you feel is gonna be workable. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I would just suggest that we make that an agenda item for the next meeting to make sure that the commission can discuss that aspect. How we're all feeling about preparedness to go to the public with these or other ideas soon versus needing to have some more resolution among our group before we're
Okay.
ready to take something to the public.
Yep, sounds good. I will make sure that that gets added.
Okay, and I'm sorry that I used up our 2 minutes with my question, but it is 9 o'clock, and in fairness to all, I will end the meeting, and thank you very much for this great presentation, and thanks everybody for attending. I notice we have a lot of non-commission members, which is great to see the participation and interest, so thanks, everyone.
Okay, so a meeting is adjourned, right?
Meeting is adjourned, yes.
Okay, all right,
Thanks.
Yeah.
all right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
But